Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Survivor 46 following episode several, and this ended up being a better episode than it had any business being, considering that a lot of the split tribals in the new era haven't been too interesting, though I feel like the one we got this season definitely had more intrigue compared to others, and there was definitely more interesting gameplay heading up into the vote, but we'll get to that soon enough. But there are 12 people to talk about, and not so wasting more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 12, we have the first boot from the split tribal, and here we have Tim Spicer, and this kind of fits for him considering his edit up to this point, where again, despite him having stuff to do and despite him seeming like a somewhat interesting character, he really doesn't get much to do across the season, and in a lot of ways his edit reminds me of Sifu's from 45, where even though Tim isn't as big of a character compared to Sifu, he still feels like someone who could have gotten more content and could have brought some entertainment to the show, but they simply didn't want us to feel bad for him when he was taken out, and he's taken out in a similar spot, taken out in the first split tribal, being cut before the jury. And even within this episode, he only gets one confessional, which obviously is similar to Sifu's as well, where he only got one confessional in his boot episode. So again, him going out in this spot isn't too surprising at the end of the day, even though the episode itself dunked more on Q, but we'll get to that soon enough. But again, he is now out of the game to where he's here, number 12. Now moving on to number 11, we have the other boot from the split tribal and the first member of the jury, and here we have Soda. And I feel like Soda's edit has been leaning towards a downfall for a while now, with a lot of the focus around Teevin talking about her as being a big threat and Venus like not being too pleased with her. And that largely comes to roost here. Now, I do think it was a bit more up in the air over who the boot was coming into this side of things, where even though Soda had been getting more set up to a downfall sooner rather than later, I also feel like Venus had an edit that could have led it to being a first juror where she was a relatively big character here. So I feel like it could have gone either way there, though by the end of it, it does make sense for Soda to be taken out here. And again, Soda's a bit of a weird player to talk about, as even though she was a pretty social player and we saw Jeff propping her up as someone who could have won the game on the On Fire podcast, I feel like she was never in that great of a spot coming into it, where despite her being this pretty social person and someone who wanted to give herself options moving forward, I feel like she did it a bit too blatantly to where it caused people like Teevin and Hunter to turn on her, despite her initially having good bonds with them, and it does seem like she would have gone home had they ever gone to tribal, and she was one of the few people that tried to build a bond with Venus early on, and while she does eventually try to distance herself from Venus, by that point she had already sown distrust between Teevin and Hunter there, and she really isn't able to repair that the rest of her time there, which is pretty bad. Again, I feel like her game itself isn't too great considering her position during a lot of it, but she does at least survive the merge tribal without having immunity, so that's something at least. But again, Soda was someone I never really saw as that top of a contender considering her edit, but now she is out of the game to where she is here at number 11. And before we continue, I am once again partnering up with Russell Muscle TV to promote Idle Plays. Idle Plays is an online shop where you can purchase Survivor puzzles and practice them. That way you can potentially be the next challenge beast on Survivor 47 and beyond. In this season, we have creator lockers. These are special bundles handpicked by myself and other Survivor YouTubers, along with creator trading cards. If you purchase my puzzle, you can get your hands on the Labyrinth Ball puzzle, the Slide puzzle, and Spencer's puzzle from Survivor Cambodia. If you want to take home these puzzles and more, feel free to use my link in the description or use my affiliate code, Survivor Gumball, and start prepping now. And with that, there are 10 people left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. By number 10, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point is still Liz. And I think the weird thing about Liz is, on paper, she should be pretty safe moving forward, where she does seem to be pretty close to Teevin and Hunter, and through that, she should be in it for a bit. Not to mention that she is a relatively small threat in the grand scheme of things. I still feel like she has zero chance to win the game from an edit standpoint, considering her edit up to this point has been mostly under the radar and a bit Dodo-ish, where even in this episode, like she talks about how like she doesn't even bring her bag to tribal, which isn't a great look there. And I feel like she's one of the few people left in the game that the show has made zero effort to really prop up and really has cast her to the side for the most part. And I can very well see her like fall into the Jamie Lynn role, someone who is kind of just taken out towards the end game despite her not being a big of a threat. I could also see her just being a losing finalist. So either way, while I don't think she's necessarily going home soon, at the same time, I just don't see how she wins the game. I feel like she has the least positives to really prop up with her edit. which is why I do have her here number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have someone who got pretty dunked on across this episode, and here we have Q. And I've continued to get comments about how I'm wrong about Q, how I've been too low on him, and how I should have him higher, but this episode to me just further confirmed that he's just not really being set up to do well here. Where one of the complaints I've had with him before is, despite him coming off as this big player, he really hasn't been effective in what he's been doing, and I think this episode really exemplified that. Where at this point, the Journey Alliance that he had a hand in creating has completely fractured at this point, and he goes against it by trying to target Hunter, someone who was part of that alliance, but even then, he doesn't even get Hunter out, and we even see later in the episode him switching his target to Ben, and his edit here is just all over the place, and at the same time, he comes off as pretty cocky. You had the scene at the beginning of the episode where he sits down Charlie to tell him that he screwed up by telling Venus that he was to vote for her, which, to be fair, he isn't wrong, but at the same time, I feel like the show presented in a mostly negative light, with Charlie coming back at him saying that Q is calling the shots, and Charlie says that he wants to target him in the future, which is pretty bad for him. You also have him claiming that he threw the challenge to see if his alliance was strong, but obviously that doesn't really hold by the end of it in relation to the Journey Alliance. And again, you also have Kenzie and Tiffany talking about how he's calling all the shots and how in general he just seems to be a bit too out in front. And you also have his confessional of him talking about Tim and how Tim's trying to give himself multiple options, and he wonders whether he's playing the Sega game or the Q game, which I also found that to be pretty funny. But really, I think this episode just really set up Q for a downfall here, which has really been the case for a lot of the season, but I feel like this episode really put that on full display. I can't really see how Q gets anywhere near the end at this point, which is why I do have him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who I continue to be out on after this episode, and here we have Venus. And again, Venus is kind of in a weird spot at this point. As I said that there was a rationale for her to go out this episode, as her edit up to this point has felt like that of a first juror, like someone who has gotten a pretty big edit. And at this point, she's obviously survived that, won the battle against Soda, but now it's she's also gotten a decent amount of negativity with people talking about how she just is too blunt in the game. You have Maria openly telling her that she's just too confrontational. And in general, you have plenty of people talking about how she's pretty annoying and how they don't really vibe with her. And you also have her coming up with this plan of splitting the vote to blindside Teevin in a 3-2-1 that doesn't really go anywhere. And even though she does survive this round, I just don't really see how she wins the game, purely from a game standpoint, considering that people just don't seem to like her that much, and I can't really see how she wins a jury vote at that point. And at the same time, while she has gotten plenty of focus in the edit, and we have seen plenty of her perspective, I just don't really see how it leads to a win where, again, I just don't really see her having the relationships or the respect to win a jury vote anyway, which kind of leaves her here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and this person had a pretty weird episode, though not one I think will lead to a win, and here we have Teevin. And obviously Teevin had a pretty big episode here, where he talks about wanting to curate the first blindside of the season, and really setting himself up as a pretty big character here. Although his actual vote by the end of it isn't really that well explained, where he ends up voting for Venus, despite the fact that a lot of his content up to this point in the season have been him talking about Soda being this big threat. Now if I had to guess, he probably just did this to avoid a shot in the dark play where he wanted to ensure that Venus would go home in case Soda's shot in the dark hit. So from a pure gain standpoint, it's not that bad at the end of the day, but it's still strange that the episode doesn't really explain his whole decision making, despite the fact that he had talked earlier in the episode about how he wanted to be behind this blindside. And if anything, I felt like Charlie got more content about him being the swing vote, where he talks about how him and Maria are going to control this game after the vote, which I feel like is probably better for Charlie's edit moving forward compared to Tevin's. And in general, I think this episode didn't really do much to change my perception of Teevin, where he comes off as this pretty big player and someone who's going to be set up as the king to be taken down the road. Kind of reminded me of Drew from 45. So really, I don't think this episode really did much to increase his winner odds for me, and I feel like there are other people that are more likely to get towards the end and win the game compared to Teevin at this point, where I feel like Teevin is still being primed to be taken out before the end, which is a big reason why I still have him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have another person who doesn't really get their way here, or at least based on the show, and here we have Tiffany. And Tiffany got a weird episode here where she articulates how Ben's this big long-term threat that needs to be taken out, while she would prefer to keep Tim around as Tim's not really a threat, but yet she proceeds to vote out Tim anyway. So this is a big case of her not getting her way here, and I could very well see this backfiring her down the road. So in general, not a great look there, and considering her content up to this point, not looking good for her long term. I will say she does at least vote in the majority. It's not as if she's being blindsided here. And also, she is close to Kenzie, and I feel like this episode does make it clear that the Tiffany and Kenzie relationship will at least be important moving forward, which I think is a big pro over Teevin. And considering how I'm higher on Kenzie at this point, I do think that's a slight pro for Tiffany, but at this point, I do feel like it's pretty unlikely that she's going to pull it out by the end of it, which is why she's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and I feel like this person didn't really go up so much as other people moved down, but number 5 I do have Maria, and Maria's episode here is fine. I mean, she does win immunity, she does get to talk about that, which I think is at least a minor pro. But beyond that, I think there's also some pretty questionable stuff, like her conversation with Venus, how she pretty much admits to Venus that her social game sucks. And while I would agree with Maria, we also get that confessional from Venus where she pretty much calls out Maria for being this person that's used to calling the shots, and how we get to see Venus's perspective of that interaction. And I think the edit is supposed to make us root for Venus in the situation, as we're meant to see Maria as someone who doesn't get Venus and someone who's a bit unaware there. I feel like they did not need to show that. So I do think that kind of undercuts Maria to a degree. That, and also Maria did seem a bit more on board with taking out Venus, considering the talk that she gave her, not really vocalizing a desire to vote out Soda, which admittedly is not a terrible thing, but it's also not particularly great. So at this point, I'm kind of lukewarm on Maria, but I don't really see her as a top contender at this point, which is why she's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I did drop on this person. I feel like this was kind of a breaking point for me, but number 4, we do have Hunter. And Hunter is someone who I have defended at points during the season, and I feel like his placement in previous weeks was kind of a cop-out to a degree, as even though he wasn't someone I was overly impressed by, he was someone who I felt more comfortable with. But I feel like this episode was kind of a breaking point where, even though he was in direct danger during this round, and this should have been a point where he could have gotten a lot of credit for saving himself, I feel like this episode doesn't really do that really at all, where even though the bulk of his content is him talking about how he's going to play his idol and that he's going to do whatever it takes to get the jury, he not only doesn't play his idol, but he also doesn't really get much content in terms of steering the votes away from him. I feel like there's more focus on the Yanus and even Ben getting more content than him. And I feel like this was a massive missed opportunity for Hunter here to really get propped up in the edit, really seeing him getting out of a tough situation. I just don't have as much to really prop up Hunter's edit at this point compared to the top 3. I feel like the top 3 have more things I can point to at this point in the season that will lead towards a win for them. And I feel like Hunter is someone who I've kind of been losing faith in. I feel like he's someone who could be a massive threat down the line, where that was a big rationale for him being targeted in this episode. And even though he got out of it this time, I just don't see how it sticks for too long in the game, which is why I do have to leave him behind at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this episode was kind of good for this person, but at the same time, I've been very conflicted about their edit as a whole, and here we have Charlie. And I think this episode was, on paper, pretty good for Charlie, where despite him being down numbers, he does end up being the swing vote during this tribal along with Maria, and he gets the bulk of the content for the duo, where he is the one being shown operating throughout this round. And he articulates how if they can get through this round that he and Maria will get to control the game, which does seem like pretty good foreshadowing here. So again, on paper, this is a pretty good episode for him. The reason I don't have him higher is, again, a lot of the stuff before this episode where he's been giving off mixed signals, where there are times where he gets good episodes, there are times where he gets not so good episodes. And I'm not really sure what to make of that in the grand scheme of things. But compared to the others, he's definitely more of a major character, definitely has more of a case to win the game compared to other people, but I feel like the top 2 have more of a case to win the game at this point compared to Charlie, which is why I had to leave him behind at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I'm sure some people will feel like this person is too high, but I feel like compared to the other people, I still think this person could be a dark horse to win, and here we have Ben. And again, on paper, this was not a good round for Ben, where he does end up voting in the minority by sticking with Tim, only to lose him there. And he was even talked about as a potential target coming to this vote, so make it that as you will. So again, on paper, this was not a good round for Ben game-wise. However, edit-wise, I don't think it was that bad for him, where early on he has his panic attack, which leads into his relationship with Kenzie that presents both him and Kenzie in a pretty sympathetic light. You also have Q being presented as a bit of a villain due to Q being probably one of the main people talking about targeting Ben during this round, and I feel like that will lead towards Q being taken out down the road. And in general, I feel like this content has been pretty consistent with Ben through and through, where he has this pretty clear philosophy on how to play the game, someone who's pretty chill, someone who cares a lot about people and emotions, and he hasn't really been undercut in the way that you would expect him to. So even though this was a bad round for him game-wise, I think the mixture of his positive content, aside from that, the fact that the show doesn't focus as much on the fact that he was on the outs, and also his relationship with Kenzie that could become a major storyline down the road, are things that keep him in contention for me, at least for this week. Now, whether I'm reaching for straws, we'll have to see, but for now, I will decide to leave Ben here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I leave is the most likely to win Survivor 46 at this point is Kenzie. And I have finally jumped onto the Kenzie bandwagon, where I feel like this was a pretty solid episode for Kenzie here, where she really gets to prop up her relationship with Ben, talking about how she sees him as a friend and that there are points in the game where you just have to step outside of it. Again, that was pretty sympathetic content for her there. You also have her winning immunity that talks about how, like, despite her being on Yanu, she manages to finally win a challenge. And in general, she does seem to come out on top here, where even though she does have a hand in taking out Tim, she also calls out Q for being this chaotic player, and I feel like that will be set up for her taking out Q down the road, despite the Yanu seeming on paper to be this underdog unified group. You also have her relationship with Tiffany becoming more of a focus now, where I feel like they'll become a big duo in the future. And I feel like Kenzie has a lot going for her at this point in the edit, where I feel like there's a lot of setup for her having these key relationships that will drive her throughout the game. And mixing that with the fact that her edit has been on the upswing over time, I do feel like that is all pretty good for Kenzie. Now, I will also admit that she hasn't had a cooldown episode, which could be a knock against her edit-wise, where it feels like she could be a bit too prominent and a bit too obvious, but I feel like her edit has been on this upswing in recent weeks, which is pretty beneficial for her considering that this is the post-merge, and this is normally the point in the season where your edit really starts to take a step forward. So I feel like all those things are looking pretty good for Kenzie, and a big reason that I have her here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. And I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can forward to that. I'm covering other shows right now, such as Big Brother Canada 12 and The Amazing Race 36, so you can expect weekly power rankings of those shows. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.